Okay, so today we're gonna dive into this this question that's been floating around Europe for a while now, with all this stuff going on in the world with the global politics and everything, and is the U.S. really going to be there to protect Europe forever with their big nuclear shield? And if not, can Europe actually like go it alone and build their own nuclear defense? I mean, it's a huge question, right?
Yeah, it's a really big question, and it really cuts to the core of how Europe sees itself in the world and how it sees its relationship with the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. Like for so long, it's just been this assumption, that the U.S. would always have Europe's back, no matter what, with their nuclear weapons. But, um, things are changing, aren't they? I mean, we've got these sources here, some analysis of how Europe's thinking about this whole nuclear dilemma, and then now some stuff about Germany potentially making a huge change in their defense policy, and even France,
Yeah.
thinking about, maybe expanding its nuclear protection to other countries.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating, I think, is how much this is being driven by just a lack of confidence in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for decades, that guarantee from the U.S. was rock solid. It's like the bedrock of European security. But I think things really started to shift, maybe with the Trump presidency,
Mm-hmm.
with that kind of more transactional approach to global security.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't the same old, automatic guarantee that Europe was used to. I mean, that really shook things up, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you had people like J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, right, speaking at
Hmm.
the Munich Security Conference,
Yeah.
earlier this year, and he basically told European leaders straight up,
Hmm.
you know, that it was time for Europe to step up and really start providing for its own defense.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty direct.
Yeah, it was a pretty clear message, I think. And first, I think Europe's response was mostly focused on the conventional stuff,
Yeah.
boosting their own militaries, giving more support to Ukraine,
Yeah.
pushing for more weapons made in Europe, that kind of thing.
Yeah, the usual stuff.
Right, exactly. But what's really interesting, I think, is this idea that's gaining momentum now of a truly European nuclear umbrella.
Yeah.
One that wouldn't rely on the U.S. at all, and that is a radical shift. It's a huge departure from how things have always been done.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. Like when we say, Europe building its own nuclear defense, what are we actually talking about here? Like who are the players? What kind of nukes are we talking about? Because I think for most people when they think nuclear weapons, they think, US and Russia.
Right, right, of course, and those are the big players globally.
Right.
Right. But Europe isn't starting from nothing. France has a pretty substantial nuclear arsenal, probably around 290 warheads. And then the UK has, around 225 of those U.S. designed Trident missiles. So,
Yeah.
those are real
My God.
capabilities.
Yeah. I mean, that's a serious amount of firepower, but obviously nothing like, the thousands that the US and Russia have.
No, not even close,
Yeah.
but still, significant. And those existing arsenals are now at the center of some pretty serious strategic discussions, right?
Mhm.
The idea of a combined Franco-British nuclear deterrent, it's not just an abstract idea anymore. It's being talked about at the highest levels.
Yeah, and it's not just Macron pushing this, right? I mean, we've got Friedrich Merz, who's likely to be the next German chancellor. He's also talking about, maybe negotiating with France and the UK to get Germany under their nuclear protection.
Yeah, and that would be a huge deal, for Germany to
Yeah.
basically say, okay, we're going to rely on, European nuclear weapons. That's a massive shift, and it shows you how much things are changing.
Yeah, I mean, after World War II and everything, Germany being a non-nuclear country, it was like a core part of their identity, and now they're talking about this. It's amazing.
It's really striking, and it's not just Germany, right? The Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has come out and supported this idea, and it's even been discussed, behind closed doors, in diplomatic circles, and even countries like Sweden and Denmark, who have always been pretty hesitant about nukes. Even they're starting to express some interest in what Macron's proposing.
Wow, so this really is a big deal, huh?
It really shows you how much concern there is in Europe about the future of their security, and whether the U.S. is going to be there for them in the long run.
Okay, so let's dig into France's nuclear strategy for a bit here, because it seems like a big part of their whole thing is this idea of national control. They're really adamant about keeping their nukes totally under French control.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, ever since General de Gaulle, way back when created France's nuclear deterrent, they've been super clear about that. It's a matter of national pride.
Yeah.
French from beginning to end, as Macron has said many times.
Yeah.
They control everything.
Yeah.
The warheads, the submarines, the whole shebang.
Yeah, but they have talked about, extending their nuclear protection to other countries, haven't they? Like historically at least.
Yeah. During the Cold War, there were definitely discussions about that. But it never really went anywhere. And it's important to remember that the UK has never really done anything like that. They've never offered to share their nuclear umbrella with anyone else, and their warheads are still under NATO command.
Which, I guess that kind of makes sense, right? NATO's whole point is to be this collective defense organization, and they've got nukes, And so in a way, they're already providing some kind of nuclear protection for Europe.
Right, exactly. And that's the system that's been in place for decades. But clearly some countries are starting to wonder if that's enough, if that's going to be enough in the future.
Well, and it's interesting, right? Because you've got Macron talking about this European debate on nuclear deterrence. And then at the same time, you've got the Polish president, Duda, actually asking the U.S. to deploy nukes in Poland.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. It shows you how different the perspectives are in Europe, right? Duda basically said, it would be safer if those weapons were already here, talking about U.S. nukes. So there's still a lot of trust in the U.S. nuclear umbrella, from some countries at least.
Right. So when we look at the numbers, though, like France has, roughly 290 warheads, and the U.S. and Russia have thousands, right? Does that even matter? Can France actually be a credible nuclear power with that many nukes?
Well, it definitely limits their options.
Yeah.
As Yannick Pincé, the historian, puts it, France can only threaten strategic retaliation, basically hitting the opponent hard enough to make them think twice about attacking this. Mm-hmm. They don't have the flexibility that the U.S. has with their huge arsenal.
Yeah, the U.S. can do what they call, graduated responses, right? Like they have all these different options for how they might use nuclear weapons.
Exactly. And France doesn't really have that. Their doctrine is more like, last resort. Only if France itself is under direct threat, they're not going to use nukes for anything less than that.
Which makes you wonder, right? Like if Europe's trying to build a unified nuclear strategy, how do you even reconcile those two approaches? Like France is all about last resort and the U.S. is much more flexible.
It's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
Michel Yakovlev, who used to be a deputy commander at NATO,
yeah,
he makes the point that people often underestimate just how small France's arsenal is and how that limits their strategic options.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think this also raises this whole question of nuclear culture. It's not just about having the weapons, it's about having the mindset, the strategic thinking that goes along with being a nuclear power.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Yakovlev said this great thing. He said, one thing that the Europeans don't have is nuclear culture. Mm-hmm. They don't understand it because they've always presumed that the Americans would handle it. And he's right. For a lot of European countries, they've just never had to really think about nuclear strategy. Mm-hmm. The U.S. is always taking care of that for them.
And that's where Macron's idea of, having European allies participate in French nuclear exercises becomes really interesting. It's not about giving them control of the nukes, but it's about giving them a better understanding of how it all works, kind of bringing them into the fold strategically, even if France still has the final say.
Yeah, exactly. And Macron has been crystal clear about that. He's said the decision to launch a nuclear strike will always be his and his alone. Mm. The UK has also been doing some work within NATO to try and improve, the general understanding of nuclear deterrence among the allies. Lucas Kulesa from RSIO, he said that the UK is trying to make sure that all allies understand the grammar of nuclear deterrence.
Right. So it's like they're teaching them the language, but they're not giving them the keys to the car.
Exactly. And it's interesting because Heather Williams from CSIS, she pointed out that, it's not like European countries are starting from scratch here. They've been under this extended nuclear deterrence for a long time.
Yeah.
But as she said, there's a big difference between being under the umbrella and actually holding the umbrella yourself,
Yeah, that's a good point. So, with all this talk about Europe stepping up, is there actually any evidence that the U.S. is really pulling back on its nuclear commitments to Europe?
It's hard to say for sure. On the one hand, you have those statements from people like J.D. Vance, basically telling Europe to get its act together. But then on the other hand, you have things like that bomber flight. The U.S. flew a nuclear-capable bomber over Stockholm, right when Sweden joined NATO.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Right. So that was clearly a symbolic show of support, And then there's this report that the U.S. is actually getting ready to put nukes back at its air base in the UK. They haven't had them there for like 15 years. So, that could be seen as a sign that they're actually doubling down on their commitment to Europe.
Yeah. It's a mixed bag for sure. So looking ahead then, what are the biggest challenges, for Europe if they want to create a real nuclear strategy? What are the possibilities?
Well, one of the biggest things is just time. Lucas Kulesa from RUSI said that building a truly independent European nuclear deterrent would take years, if not decades, and it would cost a fortune. It's not just about having a bunch of warheads. It's about having a credible deterrent, and that takes a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, the UK has been having some trouble with that, right? With their defense budget being cut and those missile tests that went wrong.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, those are definitely red flags. We raise questions about whether they're really up to the task, But the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, he's promised to boost defense spending, a lot, actually the most since the Cold War. So, maybe that'll help. But as Kulesa said, nukes aren't a magic solution. You need a strong conventional military too. You need both.
Okay, so this brings us to Germany and this potential shift in their thinking. Friedrich Merz, he's probably going to be the next chancellor. And he's already said that he wants to talk to France and the UK about sharing nuclear weapons. I mean, that's a huge deal, right?
It is. Yeah, it's a big shift for Germany. But it's important to understand what he's actually saying.
Uh-huh.
He's not saying that Germany should get its own nukes.
Mm-hmm.
That's still off the table. But he's saying that they should work more closely with France and the UK, maybe share some of the burden, be more involved in the whole nuclear deterrence thing.
So it's more about cooperation than about Germany actually getting its own bombs?
Exactly. Yeah, he said that they need to be stronger together in nuclear deterrence, and that this is about supplementing the U.S. nuclear umbrella, not replacing it.
Which, I mean, that makes sense, right? Like, Germany has always been a big supporter of NATO and the Transatlantic Alliance, but it seems like Merz is also realizing that they can't just rely on the U.S. forever.
Yes, he's definitely acknowledging that the world is changing, and that Europe needs to be more self-reliant when it comes to defense. He said that the changed global security situation now necessitates that we Europeans discuss this matter together.
So do you think this is also a way of sending a message to the U.S., like, hey, we're serious about this. You can't take us for granted anymore.
I think it's definitely a possibility. It's a way of saying that Europe is willing to take on more responsibility, but that they also need the U.S. to be a reliable partner. And this is happening at the same time that Macron is talking about extending France's nuclear deterrent. And you've got EU leaders meeting to talk about boosting defense spending and finding alternatives to U.S. support. So there's a lot of momentum behind this idea of a more independent Europe.
And Germany's in a unique position, right?
Yeah.
Because they're not allowed to have their own nukes.
Right. Because of those treaties after World War II.
Yeah.
So they can't just go out and build a bomb, but they are part of NATO's nuclear sharing agreement, so they have U.S. nukes on their soil, but they're under U.S. control.
So this idea of working with France and the UK is like a way for them to be more involved in nuclear deterrence without actually breaking those treaties.
Yeah. Exactly. It's a way for them to kind of have their cake and eat it too,
Yeah.
But it's still a really controversial idea, and it's going to be tough for Merz to sell it politically. He's already had to backtrack on some of his campaign promises, about spending and debt and stuff. And any changes in nuclear policy would probably require changes to the Constitution, which would be really hard to get through Parliament.
Yeah, and he's also got to deal with the Green Party, right?
Yeah.
Who are part of his coalition, and they're not exactly known for being pro-nuclear.
Right. The Greens are really focused on climate change,
Mm-hmm.
and they're worried that all this talk about nuclear weapons is going to distract from that,
Yeah.
So Merz has got his work cut out for him. He's trying to reassure them that he's still committed to climate action, but it's going to be tough.
Yeah, I mean, forming a government in Germany is never easy, right? And now you've got all these extra layers of complexity with these nuclear discussions and, the AfD on the rise and everything. It's a mess.
Yeah, it's a really complicated situation, and it's hard to say how it's all going to play out. The big question is whether Merz can convince the German people that this is the right move, that this is the best way to guarantee their security in the long run.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about France and this idea of actually extending their nuclear shield. Our sources suggest that this is a serious possibility. And again, it's driven by those same fears about the U.S., and whether they're going to be there for Europe in the long term.
Yeah, this is really a new chapter in European defense, and it's being driven by this sense that the U.S. might be turning away from its old allies, and Trump really accelerated that, with his America First agenda.
Yeah, and Europe's initial response was pretty predictable, right? More military spending, trying to build up their own defenses, more aid to Ukraine, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But now they're starting to think bigger, and Macron's proposal to open this debate about extending France's nuclear deterrent, that's a really bold move. He said, I want to believe that the United States will remain by our side, but we need to be ready if that is no longer the case. So he's basically saying that Europe needs a plan B.
Right. And he's been very vague about the details, right? Like, how would this even work in practice?
Yeah, he's deliberately keeping things ambiguous, and that's part of the strategy. It's like with NATO's Article 5, it's this vague promise of collective defense, but nobody knows exactly what it means, and that makes it harder for an enemy to exploit any weaknesses.
So it's like a deterrent in itself, just the uncertainty.
Exactly. And it's interesting to compare France and the UK here. They're both nuclear powers, but they have very different approaches.
Yeah.
The UK is totally reliant on U.S. technology for their nukes, whereas France has always insisted on being completely independent. They make their own warheads, their own submarines, their own everything.
Yeah, they're really proud of that.
Oh, yeah. It's a big deal for them, and it gives them a lot of freedom. They don't have to answer to anyone when it comes to their nuclear policy. And then there's the whole question of who actually controls the nukes. In France, it's the president. He has the sole authority to launch a nuclear strike. Whereas in the UK, it's a bit more complicated. It's technically the monarch, but in practice, it's the prime minister.
So it's less clear-cut in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. And when we talk about France extending its nuclear shield, one of the big questions is how do you do that without just giving nukes to a bunch of other countries? That would be a disaster.
Right. That would violate all kinds of treaties.
Exactly. So people are talking about different options.
Yeah.
Like maybe France could station some of its nukes in allied countries, or maybe they could just fly patrols over those countries with their nuclear bombers, But the key thing is that France would always retain control of the weapons, so it wouldn't be proliferation.
So it's like they're providing the protection, but they're keeping the keys.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this wouldn't be like a blank check. It wouldn't mean that France would automatically nuke anyone who attacks one of their allies.
Yeah.
Emmanuel Maitre, she made that very clear. She said that Macron's goal is actually to lower the risk of conflict, by creating a more credible deterrent.
Yeah. So it's not about making it easier to start a nuclear war.
No, not at all. It's about making it less likely that anyone would even think about attacking Europe, because they know that France might retaliate.
And France's nuclear doctrine is very much focused on defense, right? They're not talking about using nukes to conquer territory or anything like that.
Right. They're very clear about, their nukes are for deterrence, for preventing an attack on France or its vital interests.
And they have a lot fewer nukes than the U.S. and Russia, right?
They do. They have less than 300 warheads compared to the thousands that the U.S. and Russia have. But their strategy is different. They're not trying to fight a global nuclear war. They're focused on deterring a specific attack on France. And their warheads are designed to target an enemy's most important assets, their command centers, their industrial sites, the things that would really cripple their ability to wage war.
It's a more targeted approach?
Exactly. And it's interesting because this whole idea of extending France's nuclear shield has caused some debate, even within France. Some people on the far right, like Marine Le Pen, they're totally against it. They say that France's nuclear deterrent should be for France and France alone.
Yeah. I could see that point of view.
Right. But then you have other people like Jordan Bardella, who's also on the far right. But he thinks that Europe is already covered by France's vital interest doctrine. So basically, he's saying that France would already defend its allies if they were attacked because it would be in France's own interest to do so.
Ah, okay. So it's kind of a technicality.
Yeah, kind of. And Emmanuel Maitre, she said that this whole question of whether France's vital interests extend beyond its borders has been debated for a long time. There's no easy answer.
Yeah, it's tricky, but ultimately I think France's strategy relies a lot on this idea of uncertainty.
Right.
Like nobody knows for sure what they would do in a given situation, and that makes them unpredictable and therefore more dangerous.
Yeah, Alain Deneuve, he put it really well. He said that any adversary thinking about attacking Europe has to factor in this French deterrent. They can't just ignore it, even if they don't know exactly what it means.
So it's a psychological weapon as much as a physical one?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a really important takeaway from all of this. Nuclear deterrence is as much about perception as it is about reality.
So to sum up then, we've seen this erosion of this unquestioned U.S. nuclear umbrella, and that's led to all these discussions in Europe about maybe going it alone, and building their own nuclear defense. And it's mainly focused on France right now, maybe with the UK playing a supporting role and Germany trying to figure out where it fits in.
Right, and it's a really complex issue.
Yeah.
There are so many factors to consider. The size of the arsenals, the different doctrines, the political will, the whole idea of nuclear culture. And then you've got the geopolitical landscape, which is constantly shifting.
Yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around. And it all comes back to those big questions. Can Europe really become a nuclear power in its own right? And what would that mean for the world?
And for the relationship between Europe and the U.S., that's a huge question, too. If Europe goes nuclear, does that mean the end of NATO? Does it mean a new Cold War?
Yeah, I mean, the implications are huge. And I think for our listeners, the big question is, what do you think is going to be the deciding factor? Is it going to be technology? Is it going to be political will? Is it going to be something else entirely? I think it's something we all need to be thinking about because this is going to shape the world for generations to come.
Yeah. It's not something that's going to be resolved overnight.
Mm-hmm.
This is a long game, and we're just at the beginning of it.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap it up for today, but this is definitely a conversation that we're going to have to keep having. So stay tuned, folks.
Absolutely. This is just the beginning.